This is Chapter 18, Environmental Risks and Human Health. And it's a pretty interesting chapter from the standpoint that it talks about a lot of things that, they're interesting. Diseases and causes of death and human behavior. And it also kind of gives you a couple of views of some occupations that are out there. So let's get started. So the first thing this chapter kind of mentions here is AIDS and what it is or where it is at. We kind of mentioned it as far as HIV to start with. That's the virus that starts or begins for AIDS. And it mentions in 2010 there's 36 million people that have the HIV virus, which actually has gone down. In your book, I think it might say there's 42 million people. So it actually has decreased, and I'm not sure exactly what would be the cause that it has gone down or not. But one of the unfortunate things about HIV, of course, is once you have it, you will always have it, and eventually you will die from it. And there are drugs out there that certainly help people. I think it is somewhat individual. For example, Magic Johnson's had it for, at least 25 years. I think he's had that virus. And he appears that he's doing fine. But he also has the access to lots of good drugs, which the majority of the world does not have. So here's a little view as far as some particular countries. Botswana, I'm not sure if this is coming in over here, 2020. Real disturbing here is looking at their demographics and people with and without AIDS. It's pretty remarkable when you look at this portion of the graph here. That's a lot of people. More than 50% have the AIDS virus. In some cases, it almost looks like 75% of the population has the AIDS virus, which is terrible. And you look at as far as what has happened, we kind of think that the life expectancy goes up, but it actually has fallen from 62 years to 47 years. Now, granted, if you don't have the AIDS virus, then you probably live a much longer life, but this is an average. So what are risks and what are, our potential differences in risks that we have out there? So these are the different categories that we have. Biological would be things like the flu that we can catch from each other. Chemical risks are things that typically we can't give back and forth to each other. Physical is something that's just basically depends on where you live and what you're exposed to. And cultural is your just personal habits. So putting these in two different categories as far as these biological. You have things that, they don't have to be biological, but we have things that can be spread from one person to another, and they have to be living organisms to be spread from one person to another. Otherwise, they are considered non-transmittable. So the ones that, you can give back and forth are transmissible, and ones that are not would be non-transmissible. And again, we're typically thinking about chemical exposure, so lead. If you had a lead exposure or some impairment, physical or mental impairment, you can't give that to somebody else, so non-transmittable. This is very interesting. We talk about all these different type of ailments, and what's very surprising, not surprising I guess, but the one we don't typically talk about that much is the leading cause of, my red doesn't show up here, I'll just put a big arrow, the one that is the largest killer, cause of death in the world, is cardiovascular disease, heart disease. That is number one by far. But a lot of times the ones that get the most press, it seems to be cancer. I mean, they've already started the commercials right now for a walk that'll be in August for the 3-day walk for cancer. And of course, those are very, very important and personal. But you don't hear as much about cardiovascular, even though it's twice as likely to be a cause of death for people. And you have this other likelihood of as far as deaths over there. And then if we just spring over to the infectious disease, we see the breakdown for those. So again, a nice spread of different illnesses that people could have. Looking over here as far as what is the number one killer of people, I'll just point this one out right now. And it says pneumonia and the flu, but we'll just point out and say the flu. is the #1 killer of a transmittable disease, followed up by AIDS, a very close second there, and then down the line. And notice as far as what's causing these different illnesses, the flu is a virus, AIDS is a virus, this is a protozoa, bacterials and such down the line. So these are the vectors and the such that are killing people along the way. And of course, it's not equal amongst people. If you're looking at low income, we can look at, okay, what is the leading risk of death in these various locations. If you're in a low income place, you have all these different listings here as far as risk factors. But then you go over into the higher income, and it's very different. Look at tobacco use for low income, and for high income, it's much, much, much higher. So different risk factors depending on where you live. Biological. These listings here, as far as just some of it is just some definitions as far as what a pathogen is. A pathogen is something that will, spread, bacterial, viral, for infectious diseases. A chronic disease is something that slowly wears on you and eventually shows symptoms that could be years down the road. For example, HIV. You may have it for 10 years before you actually show any signs of having that virus. And acute is something that comes on very, very quickly. So the Spanish flu in 1918, I believe, there's reports of people showing signs of getting the flu and then dying later the same day. But that would be something that's acute. So this is a new problem. It's been in the news a little bit lately as far as some of our germs becoming resistant to our antibiotics. A couple problems there is, one is the overuse of antibiotics, and two, they're not really developing any new antibiotics today. So we have kind of a two-pronged problem there. So some of these viruses, or not viruses, bacteria, are starting to develop a resistance to the drugs that we have because people are using them all the time. So sometimes you may not even have an infection, but the doctors just throw them at you just in case you might get one, which may not be the best usage for it. So, okay. So this, for many of us, is really thought to be an old disease which is no longer an issue in the developed world, but there is a bit of a fear out there that it could be coming back. So we see here as far as tuberculosis, it kills about 1.7 million people per year, but they're estimating that it's going to skyrocket, and I'm not sure what leads into that estimation or not. Could be proximity, resistance, I'm not sure. But those numbers are expected to go up. That's quite significant. If we remember what AIDS and the flu were, they were both about 30 million, I believe, a year. So that's quite a bit. So what are the largest increases as far as why that's going up? And this is #1. So this one here is the lack of screening and control programs. So people just aren't paying attention to it until it's too late. So it's something that really has to be looked at more closely. So there it is. And then of course we mentioned earlier as far as this genetic resistance is the bacteria are becoming more and more resistant to this problem. Something else is to mention here is synergistic interactions. So you may be more susceptible to a pathogen than somebody else based upon either your lifestyle or just your physical makeup. The classic example is someone that has, won't even try to pronounce it, but someone who's breathing a lot of asbestos and they also smoke, they're going to have a much greater effect or worse effect because of the synergistic interactions. All right, this is probably a good place to take a break, and we'll pick up the second lecture in just a few minutes.